Sun's going down. Let's do this. Hi guys, I'm Lana, and I'm curious about many things. The Idaho 4 case being one of them. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this case, I did a part 1 where I sort of went over the timeline and the basics about this case, and in this part we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into the specificities. Now, my goal with these videos is to basically organize the facts that we have so far, discuss what is known, what has been confirmed, how these pieces of the puzzle could fit into the bigger picture. There is gonna be a little bit of speculation involved naturally, but I still try to sort of stay on track and stick to building theories around facts, or at least things that have been somewhat confirmed by somewhat reputable sources whenever possible. I do my best not to spread any theories that are not based in anything concrete. But if you have other opinions, if you have any theories, feel free to leave them down below. All sorts of opinions are welcome, but I'm just telling you what I will personally not be discussing. A, for the sake of clarity and staying on topic, and B, because I just don't want to muddle things with baseless theories. All of this is my opinion for entertainment purposes only. So in today's video, we're gonna go over some parts of the PCA that we haven't yet looked at. We're gonna focus on the victims, on the locations of the bodies and the injuries. We're also gonna look at the suspect vehicle and the evidence, or the lack thereof. The suspect and the survivors are gonna be the topics of the third part. So now, without further ado, let's get into this. According to the affidavit, officers Blaker and Payne arrived to the scene at around 4 p.m. on November 13th, 2022. This would have been around 12 hours after the crimes and about 4 hours after the first 911 call was received. Officer Payne describes how he entered the house. He went up the stairs and was directed towards Xana's bedroom by one of the first responders who was already there, Officer Smith. Officer Payne could see Xana's body on the floor as he approached her room, and he could tell that her wounds were caused by an edged weapon. Now, if Xana's body was visible when he was approaching the room, then she must have been somewhere in this general area of her bedroom. Whether the door was fully open or half open, this is the part that would be visible, as opposed to this section that would have been behind the door. So we can rule this area out as the location of her body. Also in the room was Ethan. The exact location of his body is not given. Also, what we learn about his injuries is that they were, quote, sharp force injuries. Pretty vague, but put a pin in that. We're gonna return to the injuries. But in regards to Ethan's body, I have two things to say, so let's pause here for a second. Firstly, we know that there is information floating around that apparently Ethan's body was blocking the door, and that Ethan's friend, HJ, found him when he was called over by the roommates because they couldn't open the door to Xana's bedroom, and then he did open the door and he saw what he saw, and that was how the first responders got called to the scene. Now, to my knowledge, this information apparently came from HJ, the friend who allegedly found Ethan. He told this to Christy Gonzalez, Kaylee's mother, who then told this to a YouTuber who recounted her words on his podcast. This is just too much of a telephone game for my liking. So I'm really hesitant to entertain this theory as a fact. That's not to say that I think it's necessarily false, but it is, after all, it's word of mouth so far. I will say this. Is it possible that when the roommates couldn't open the door, they called HJ and potentially some other people to the scene, and they managed to open the door, that they pushed Ethan's body behind the door, thus opening the door somewhat? Is that why Xana's body was visible to Officer Payne when he arrived to the scene, and Ethan's body was now hidden behind the door, so he only saw him when he entered and he was like, oh, Ethan's in the room? Yes, that's a very possible scenario, very likely scenario, I would say. But there are still questionable things about this theory, at least without further context, right? Why would two girls who couldn't open the door call someone else to the house to help them when they have two other roommates upstairs? Why wouldn't they go to them first, right? To Maddie and Kaylee. because allegedly at this point they didn't yet know that Maddie and Kaylee were also gone. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, if Ethan's body was blocking the door, then we have to ask ourselves, how did the perpetrator get out of Ethan and Xana's room? Because DM, the roommate, allegedly saw the perpetrator walk past her door and out the sliding glass door, out through the kitchen. And that's how they assume he left at that point. So coming out of Ethan from the direction of Xana's bedroom. So how did he get out if Ethan was blocking the door? But the second thing I want to mention in regards to the position of the bodies on the second floor is the following. So I'm going to show you a picture, somewhat graphic, but if you are familiar with this case, you've probably seen it already. This is one of the mattresses that was removed from 1122 King Road. I did have a theory, but as I was scripting this, I started having a few doubts. But here's the thing. We know that Kaylee and Maddie were found together in one bed on the third floor, and Xana was found on the floor, as per the PCA. And then we have a mattress being taken out of the house with an outline of what seems to be one person. So, while I personally think this looks like an outline of one person, I also have to admit we are not seeing the full mattress. We are seeing half, maybe 2/3 of it. And it's not a very clear picture. You can tell it's not grape juice on there, okay, but it's a little bit of a stretch. But I'll still leave it in and let you guys tell me what you think, if you have any thoughts on this. Also, we have to remember that there was a stain coming from this side of the house, which would be the inside of Xana's room. It does make you think about the location, about the position of the bodies. We also don't know where the bed was, so it's very hard. Okay, so then Payne goes up to the third floor and into Maddie's room, where he sees Maddie and Kaylee both on one bed with visible stab wounds. He also noticed later a tan knife sheath next to Maddie. We also know that Kaylee's dog Murphy was apparently found by the first responders in Kaylee's room. As we have mentioned several times, both the roommates, DM and BF, were allegedly home at the time of the crimes. That's what the police told us.
So the other two roommates were there at the time of the attack?
All the information that we have from our investigation is that yes, they were.
So Payne states that BF's bedroom was down on the first floor. And this stood out to me because he doesn't specifically say that she was in her bedroom on the first floor. He just says that that's where her bedroom was, leading us to assume that she was there, but it's never really confirmed where she was. So that makes me question her exact location. Now, the rest of the PCA deals with DM's statement, what she told to the police. We went over this in part 1. And it also covers the suspect vehicle path, and the suspect himself. We will get to that in part 3. With some exceptions, I will talk about the Elantra here because there's some things that I want to mention. Since the police stated that they believe the attack was targeted, this begs the question then, who was the target? It has been speculated that maybe the house was the target, but then that to me makes me wonder then why the two roommates survive. I will talk a little bit about who the potential target could have been out of the 4 victims, and I want to go back to the cars parked in front of the house. I did go over this in part 1, but to summarize, if the red Jeep was driven to the scene after the crime by Ethan's brother Hunter and was not originally parked there when the crimes took place by Ethan, this immediately makes me wonder, was Ethan at the wrong place at the wrong time? To be fair, he does stand out. He was the only one who didn't live there out of the 4 victims. He was the only male out of the 4 victims. Yes, he was Xana's boyfriend, and he probably was at the house often, especially on the weekends. But logically, right, if you are a perpetrator, you are going into a home, wouldn't you want to have as many evidence as possible that tells you that someone you're looking for is there? Wouldn't it make more sense for someone to assume that a person who doesn't live at the house and whose car is not in front of the house is not at that house? If I'm targeting someone, don't I want as much proof as possible to know that they are where I want them to be? Unless somebody saw him walk in and targeted him specifically. Like I said, this is only true if we're making assumptions based on the cars parked outside, which may be way off mark. Maybe this had nothing to do with anything. But then there is another thing we have to consider, the fact that Kaylee's car was brand new too, and would technically also be unfamiliar to anyone unless they were specifically targeting Kaylee, in which case they knew that she had just got a new car. So I think Kaylee was either the target or also at the wrong place at the wrong time. There's one of the two extremes for her, in my opinion. Now, while we're on the topic of cars, I also want to consider the suspect vehicle number 1, aka the white Hyundai Elantra. I'll give you some context first, and here is a statement from the PCA. After reviewing the numerous observations of suspect vehicle number 1, a forensic examiner initially believed that suspect vehicle number 1 was a 2011-13 Hyundai Elantra. Upon further review, he indicated it could also be a 2011-2016 Hyundai Elantra. As a result, investigators have been reviewing information on persons in possession of a vehicle that is a 2011-16 white Hyundai Elantra. This is all fine and dandy, apart from one little detail. The police put out a search for a 2011-13 Hyundai Elantra on November 7th, 2022, and this video with Chief Fry came out one day later on December 8th. 2022.
And we're looking for a 2011 to a 2013 Hyundai Elantra. 2011 to a 2013 Hyundai Elantra.
But according to the PCA, they already had Brian Koberger's vehicle, a 2015 Hyundai Elantra, on their radar as early as November 29th. If you had already expanded your search to 2011 to 2016 Elantras by November 29th, and that's how you got Brian's 2015 car on your radar, that's fine. I have no issues with that logic, because we don't know exactly when they expanded their search from 2011 to 13 to 2011 to 16. But if you were looking for 2011 to 16 Hyundai Elantras on November 29th, then you must have been looking for 2011 to 16 Hyundai Elantras on December 7th and 8th too, right? Why then did you say on December 7th and 8th that you're looking for 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantras? Why narrow your search back down? I know there are minimal differences between these models of the car, and maybe they were looking for any Hyundai Elantra, white Hyundai Elantra in November. I could understand that, but what I don't understand is, if the search was expanded to 2011 to 16 Elantras in November, why was it narrowed back down to 2011 to 13 in December? Am I just not understanding this? Let me know, guys. What do you think? I know this next thing has been mentioned by many creators many a time, but it really is weird that they're calling it suspect vehicle number 1. Why give it a number? What were the other suspect vehicles? Suspect vehicle 2, 3, 4, or more, if there were any, because there had to have been more suspect vehicles at some point if this one got the label suspect vehicle number 1, right? So where are those vehicles? What happened to those leads? Why were they abandoned? That's also a big question that I have. And don't worry, I didn't forget about all the strange twists and turns in the neighborhood that the suspect vehicle number 1 allegedly made on the night of the murders. We're saving that for part 3 as well. Now, one more vehicle that is of interest but we don't actually know anything about is the DoorDasher's car. That delivery would almost completely overlap with what we are made to believe is the timeline of the crime. That DoorDash was delivered at around 4 a.m. If that's true, my brain instantly goes to, okay, that's why suspect vehicle number 1 was driving around for so long and making those weird turns around the neighborhood, because they were waiting for the DoorDasher to leave. But then the DoorDasher's car is not mentioned in the PCA at all, so the more I think about this, the less it all makes sense. Honestly, we don't even know if Xana ordered that DoorDash, because it just says it was delivered or Xana received the DoorDash, right? So that one's a big mystery as well. But the fact that DoorDash was being delivered and the perpetrator was entering the house at almost the exact same time, that's one heck of a coincidence, isn't it? Now, let's go back to our pin from before, and let's go to the victims and their injuries. The police did confirm that some victims had defensive wounds. Now, some, as the quantifier in English, is a little bit tricky because it tells us everything and nothing. If you check the dictionary definition, it can mean a few from a group, but not all, which I think is how most people use it. I, as a non-native English speaker, have always used it in the sense of more than two, but not all from a group. It would make sense that perhaps one of each pair on each floor did, because the first person was caught off guard and the second person in the pair would have some time to defend themselves. All we know is that Xana did have defensive wounds. That was confirmed by her father. Now, as far as Kaylee goes, yes, there was speculation that she fought back because her family stated that her wounds were more severe than Maddie's, but I haven't been able to find any explicit confirmation on what those defensive wounds were and if they were defensive wounds. As for, the victim's injuries in general, it is interesting that they are described in such different ways. According to the PCA, Maddie and Kaylee had visible stab wounds, Xana had visible wounds caused by an edged weapon, and Ethan's wounds were later determined to be caused by sharp force injuries. Now, I understand that it probably wasn't possible to tell the exact nature of injuries at the crime scene, and what is being described here is probably more or less the same, with a potential exception of Ethan's injuries. Now, I won't really dwell on this because I'm not an expert on types of wounds or what kind of vocabulary is used to describe wounds. These different word choices are definitely something that a lot of people have took under the microscope, and I think for good reason. It does make me wonder, was it even one weapon? Was it more weapons? Was it even one perpetrator, right? I want to briefly talk about the families of the victims, like the statements that they make, right? And what kind of impact that has. So I'm well aware that the Gonzalez family is the most vocal about the case. I want to phrase this in a way that doesn't come across as dismissive or disrespectful, but all the families, not just the Gonzaleses, all the families are so intimately tied to these cases. Obviously, they lost their children, but that means they are highly subjectively and emotionally involved. So when they give statements like, Kaylee's wounds were more severe than Maddie's, and Kaylee's wounds didn't match Maddie's, it does make me wonder how they got to that conclusion. I know Maddie and Kaylee were close. I guess the families probably did talk about the crimes, they did talk about the autopsy results and everything. And let's say they could come to a conclusion that their injuries definitely didn't match and that something was very different. But I wondered, do the Gonzaleses know the full extent of Ethan's injuries, the full extent of Xana's injuries? Do they know certain details about the crime scene? Do more severe injuries necessarily mean that someone was the target? Families, of course, have the right to their opinions, to their own theories, but I do want to take it with a grain of salt, because is it possible that they misinterpreted or misremembered something that they were told? I guess if the coroner said gouges, okay, a gouge is a gouge. You can't really misremember or misreport that if you heard that exact word. But I mean on a larger scale. Is it possible that they're reading into things or came to the conclusions that may not be 100% accurate because of their emotional involvement? For example, Steve Gonzalez also stated that it must have been a, quote, sadistic male who did this. This could be absolutely true, but it is a very specific statement, and when the news networks pick that up, it leads to all kinds of conclusions that may not be accurate. Okay, one person. Are we 100% sure? Male, are we sure? Sadistic? I mean, yes, the crime was very gruesome, and this must have been someone who is a really sick and twisted person. But this phrasing, sadistic, implies that someone just did this, someone took 4 lives for the sake of it, for the thrill of it. Which may again be true, but it could also be minimizing the potential importance of the motive. Maybe there is more to it than just a sadistic male, and maybe that more is very important. We have to remember that the police or the coroner tells something to the families, and then families come to the news networks, they give interviews, and they recount these things. But this information is not coming from the primary source, right? And every single one of us, when we hear something and then we report this back to someone, we are filtering this information. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the circumstance. This doesn't necessarily make the information inaccurate, but in cases like this, one comma can make a big difference. I know we're eager for any information we can get, but we also have to be critical of the sources and the type of information we get. If it fits, if we have other supporting facts that point in this direction, sure, take that information, but keep in mind what kind of information it is and where it came from. Now, lastly, I want to quickly comment on the amount of time it allegedly took to commit these crimes. One has to wonder, is 16 minutes or so enough time for someone to go into a house, unalive 4 different people on 2 different floors? If we break it down, that's about 4 minutes per person. Much less, probably, because there's a whole lot of walking and parking and going from one floor to the next involved. So yeah, it's not impossible, but I would say it's improbable. None of the victim's DNA makes its way to his apartment or to his car. None of the victims got his DNA under their fingernails or pulled a single hair off his head. 4 lives were taken with an edged weapon, yet the perpetrator, the alleged one perpetrator, didn't get a single cut. The coroner specifically said,
well, there was a lot of blood. It was a very sad scene.
Yet the perpetrator didn't step into a single puddle, and he left nothing behind other than a latent footprint, which may or may not be his. Only a knife sheath was left behind with touch DNA, and that knife sheath may or may not belong to a murder weapon or the murder weapon. Again, nothing's impossible, but this scenario, as it stands so far, 1.5 years after the crimes, not impossible, but highly improbable as far as I'm concerned. Now, as I promised, in the next part, we're gonna dive into the touch DNA, into the IgG, because it is very important, not just for this case, but, what we learned about IgG is just, whenever I'm tempted to take one of those DNA tests, I just think about this case and I'm like, nope, I'm good, thanks, I'm good. We will also finally get to discussing the suspect and the survivors a little bit. Those will be some of the topics for part 3. Let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments down below. Take care, and I will see you next Friday, hopefully, with part 3 of the Idaho 4 case.